Imagine stepping into a world where your shoes could ruin your health, bankrupt your family, or even get you laughed out of town. Believe it or not, that was the reality for people in medieval Europe, where footwear wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a full-blown disaster waiting to happen. Why were medieval shoes so bizarrely dangerous? How did people survive walking in them? And what shocking secrets about these shoes might still influence the way we dress today? Stick with me, because we're about to uncover the wild, painful, and downright weird world of medieval footwear, a journey that'll make you grateful for your sneakers. Let's dive in. Picture yourself in a bustling medieval town, circa 1350. The streets are muddy, the air smells of livestock, and everyone's obsessed with showing off their status. Your shoes? They're not just for walking, they're a billboard for who you are. But here's the kicker. The fancier your shoes, the more trouble you're in. Take the infamous poulaines, those long, pointy-toed shoes that screamed wealth and prestige. Some had toes so exaggerated, stretching up to 2 feet long, that nobles had to tie them to their knees with chains just to walk. Imagine trying to run from a rainstorm or dodge a cart in those. One wrong step, and you're face-planting in the mud, your dignity in tatters. Why would anyone wear something so impractical? It was all about flexing social status. The longer the toe, the richer you appeared, because only the elite could afford to waddle around in shoes that made working impossible. But here's a question for you. If you lived back then, would you risk a sprained ankle for clout? Drop a comment below and let me know. Now, let's talk about the dark side of this trend. Those pointy poulaines weren't just a tripping hazard. They were a health nightmare. Medieval cobblers stuffed the toes with moss or wool to keep their shape, creating a breeding ground for bacteria. No ventilation, sweaty feet, and a damp, mossy interior. That's a recipe for infections that could turn deadly in a world without antibiotics. And it wasn't just the nobles suffering. Peasants who couldn't afford custom shoes often wore ill-fitting hand-me-downs or wooden clogs that caused blisters, bunions, and lifelong foot deformities. Imagine walking miles to market in clogs that rubbed your feet raw, with no cushioned insoles or orthopedic support. Yet, despite the pain, people kept wearing these shoes. Why? Because fashion was power, and power was worth the price of a few toes. Speaking of pain, what's the most uncomfortable shoe you've ever worn? Share your story in the comments. I bet it's not as bad as a medieval poulaine. Let's shift gears to the materials, because medieval shoes weren't just poorly designed. They were made from stuff that could make your skin crawl. Wealthy folks flaunted shoes crafted from fine leather, sometimes dyed in vibrant reds or purples to show off their wealth. But here's the catch. Tanning leather back then was a gruesome process involving animal urine and dung, leaving shoes with a faint, lingering stench. Poorer folks had it worse, stitching together shoes from scraps of hide or even tree bark. These makeshift shoes fell apart in weeks, especially in Europe's rainy climate. And forget waterproofing. Medieval shoes soaked up mud like a sponge, leaving your feet freezing and prone to trench foot. Nobles tried to one-up each other with embellishments like gold thread or jewels, but those decorations often tore apart the delicate leather, making the shoes even less durable. It's wild to think that people spent fortunes on footwear that barely lasted a season. If you could design a medieval shoe to fix these issues, what would it look like? Toss your ideas in the comments. Now, let's explore why these shoes were such a cultural obsession. In medieval Europe, especially in places like England and France, laws called sumptuary laws dictated what you could wear based on your social class. Shoes were a big part of this. Only the upper crust could sport certain colors or pointy toes, so wearing flashy shoes was like waving a flag that said, "I'm better than you." But here's where it gets juicy. People cheated the system. Merchants and ambitious commoners started mimicking noble styles, sparking outrage among the elite. In 1363, England passed a law limiting toe length to 2 inches for commoners, but enforcement was a joke. People kept pushing the limits, and cobblers got rich off the demand for ever more outrageous designs. This shoe rebellion wasn't just about fashion. It was a quiet revolt against rigid class boundaries. Imagine risking a fine just to wear cooler shoes. Would you break a law for fashion? Let me know in the comments. As we dig deeper, let's talk about the craftsmanship behind these disastrous shoes. Medieval cobblers were skilled, but they worked with limited tools and inconsistent materials. Each shoe was handmade, which sounds luxurious until you realize most were shaped on generic wooden molds, not custom-fitted to your feet. This meant even expensive shoes could pinch or slip, causing endless discomfort. Plus, cobblers often prioritized looks over function to please wealthy clients. For example, some shoes had paper-thin soles to make them lighter and more elegant, but they wore out in days on cobblestone streets. Peasants, meanwhile, sometimes went barefoot to save their shoes for special occasions, trudging through mud and filth. The irony: barefoot peasants often had healthier feet than nobles limping in their fancy footwear. It makes you wonder, were medieval cobblers trolling their customers with these designs? If you were a cobbler back then, would you prioritize style or comfort? Share your thoughts below. Let's pivot to the social fallout of these fashion disasters. Medieval shoes didn't just hurt your feet, they could ruin your reputation. Pointy-toed poulaines were so controversial that the church got involved, calling them devil's horns and blaming them for moral decay. In 1215, the Pope himself banned overly long toes, claiming they encouraged vanity and sin. But did people listen? Nope. Fashion trumped religion, and the poulaine craze raged on for centuries. Meanwhile, women faced their own shoe struggles. High-status ladies wore pattens, wooden platforms strapped to their shoes to lift them above muddy streets. These were like medieval high heels, but wobblier and harder to balance. Falling off your pattens in public was a social disaster, fodder for gossip. Men and women alike judged each other's shoes ruthlessly, using them to size up wealth, status, and even morality. It's wild to think a bad shoe day could tank your social life. Have you ever judged someone by their shoes? Be honest in the comments. Now, let's zoom in on regional differences, because not all medieval shoes were created equal. In wet, chilly England, people favored sturdy leather boots, but these were often so stiff they caused shin splints. In sunny Italy, lighter, more decorative shoes were the rage, but they offered zero protection against rough terrain. And in Scandinavia, where winters were brutal, people stuffed their shoes with straw for insulation, a trick that worked until the straw got wet and moldy. These regional quirks shaped local fashion, but they also highlight a universal truth. Medieval people were obsessed with shoes despite the misery they caused. Why? Because shoes were one of the few ways to stand out in a world of rigid hierarchies. Even peasants got in on the trend, decorating their clogs with crude carvings to mimic the elite. It's a reminder that humans have always craved self-expression, no matter the cost. What's a fashion trend you followed that wasn't worth the hassle? Spill the tea in the comments. As we near the end of this wild ride, let's talk about the legacy of medieval shoes. Believe it or not, some of their quirks live on in modern fashion. The pointed toe trend? It resurfaced in the Renaissance and again in the 1980s, proving we haven't fully escaped the poulaine's grip. And those sumptuary laws? They're echoed in today's luxury brand exclusivity, where only the wealthy can afford certain logos. Even the idea of suffering for style, think high heels or tight sneakers, has medieval roots. But here's the big takeaway. Medieval shoes teach us that fashion is a balancing act between self-expression and practicality. Back then, people chose status over comfort, and sometimes we still do. Next time you slip on your favorite shoes, Take a moment to appreciate that they're not stuffed with moss or tied to your knees. What's one modern fashion item you think future generations will laugh at? Drop your predictions below. So there you have it, the shocking, painful, and utterly bizarre world of medieval shoes. From health hazards to social scandals, these fashion disasters shaped medieval life in ways you never imagined. If this video blew your mind, smash that like button and share it with a friend who's obsessed with fashion history. Want more wild tales from the Middle Ages? Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. And one last question. Would you dare wear a pair of pointy-toed poulaines for a day? Comment below and let's keep this conversation going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.